The gavel freezes midair. Every breath in courtroom 7 stops. 8-year-old Elijah Washington's trembling finger points directly at Judge Rebecca Williams, as his voice cracks the silence. "You're my real mother. I remember your perfume. I remember your lullabies." The judge's face turns ghostly white. Her gavel crashes down. Can you imagine the shock rippling through that courtroom? This is Real Stories Diary, bringing you a tale that will grip your heart and shake your soul. Before we dive deeper, where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments below, and hit that like button if you're ready for a story that will blow your mind. This isn't just any courtroom drama. This is about a little boy whose words unravel one of the most shocking conspiracies you've ever heard. Trust me, you won't want to miss a single detail of what's coming next on Real Stories Diary. Judge Rebecca Williams had spent 22 years building an unshakable reputation on the bench in Detroit Family Court. At 52, she was known throughout Michigan as the Iron Lady of Justice. A black woman who had climbed from poverty to become one of the most respected judges in the state. Her courtroom was her sanctuary. Her decisions were final, and her word was law. She had presided over thousands of custody cases, adoption hearings, and family disputes, always maintaining perfect composure. Nothing had ever rattled her until today. The morning started like any other Tuesday in October. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of burning leaves through the courthouse windows as Judge Williams reviewed her docket. Case number 27 was routine, a foster care placement hearing for 8-year-old Elijah Washington. The boy had been in the system since he was 3, bouncing between 7 different foster homes like a ping-pong ball nobody wanted to keep. His current placement was with the Hendersons, a well-meaning white couple from suburban Bloomfield Hills who were seeking permanent custody. According to his case file, Elijah was what social services politely called challenging. He had nightmares every night, claiming his real mother was still alive and looking for him. He drew disturbing pictures of courtrooms and judges, and he had a habit of staring at authority figures with an intensity that made grown adults uncomfortable. The Hendersons sat in the front row, their hands clasped nervously as they waited for their names to be called. Between them sat Elijah, a small boy with intelligent dark eyes and a serious expression that seemed far too mature for his 8 years. He wore a pressed white shirt and navy slacks that the Hendersons had bought specially for court, but somehow he still looked like he didn't belong. His eyes kept scanning the courtroom, studying every detail with the focus of someone searching for something important. Social worker Janet Pierce stood at the podium, presenting Elijah's case with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this thousands of times before. She described his behavioral issues in clinical terms: attachment disorder, possible PTSD, resistance to authority figures. She mentioned his recurring claims about his real mother being a judge, which she dismissed as fantasy born from trauma. The Hendersons took their turn at the podium, describing their genuine desire to provide Elijah with a stable home. Mrs. Henderson's voice wavered as she talked about the boy's nightmares, how he would wake up screaming for someone who wasn't there. Mr. Henderson mentioned Elijah's unusual intelligence, how he knew legal terms that number 8-year-olds should understand, how he could describe courtroom procedures with startling accuracy. Judge Williams listened to it all with her usual professional detachment, making notes and asking standard questions. She had heard similar stories before. Traumatized children often created elaborate fantasies about their origins, especially when their real history was painful or unknown. But something about this case felt different. Every time she looked at Elijah, she felt an odd flutter in her chest, a recognition she couldn't quite place. The boy was staring at her with those intense dark eyes, and she found herself avoiding his gaze. When she did meet his eyes, she saw something that made her deeply uncomfortable. Familiarity. What if this boy's claims weren't just a child's fantasy? Stay with Real Stories Diary, because what happens next will leave you speechless. As the hearing progressed, Judge Williams noticed details about Elijah that shouldn't have mattered, but somehow did. The way he tilted his head when concentrating, the way his left hand moved when he was thinking, a small birthmark on his wrist that looked like a crescent moon. She found herself studying his features more closely than she should have, looking for something she couldn't name. The Hendersons finished their testimony, and Janet Pierce was wrapping up her recommendation for permanent placement when it happened. Elijah suddenly stood up, ignoring Mrs. Henderson's urgent whispers for him to sit down. He walked to the center of the courtroom, his small figure commanding attention in a way that should have been impossible for a child his age. Every person in the room turned to watch him, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Judge Williams felt her heart rate spike as Elijah looked directly at her. His young face was serious, almost solemn, as if he was about to deliver the most important testimony of his life. When he spoke, his voice was clear and steady, cutting through the courtroom silence like a blade. "You're my real mother. I remember your perfume. I remember your lullabies." The words hit Judge Williams like a physical blow. Her carefully maintained composure cracked, and she felt the blood drain from her face. The courtroom erupted into chaos. Bailiffs moved toward Elijah, unsure whether to restrain an 8-year-old. Lawyers jumped to their feet, shouting objections and demands for order. The Hendersons gasped in shock, reaching for Elijah even as he stepped away from them. But Judge Williams couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't do anything but stare at the boy who had just shattered her world with 7 simple words. Her hands were shaking so violently that she had to grip the edge of her bench to steady herself. Her vision blurred, and for a moment she thought she might faint right there in front of everyone, because deep in her heart, in a place she had locked away 15 years ago, she knew that Elijah Washington might be telling the truth. With tremendous effort, she managed to bang her gavel and call for a 30-minute recess. As the courtroom slowly emptied, she remained frozen in her chair, staring at the spot where Elijah had stood. When she was finally alone, she reached into her desk drawer with trembling fingers and pulled out a small hidden photograph of a baby boy, a baby with the same intelligent dark eyes, the same crescent-shaped birthmark on his left wrist. The silence in Judge Williams' chambers was deafening as she sat alone, clutching the faded photograph with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. The image was worn from years of secret handling, a newborn baby with perfect features and those unmistakable dark eyes that had haunted her dreams for 15 years. She had hidden this photo behind official court documents, never daring to look at it for more than a few seconds at a time. But now, with Elijah's words echoing in her mind, she couldn't look away. The memories came flooding back like a dam had burst in her mind, releasing 15 years of carefully suppressed pain. She was 27 then, a brilliant young attorney with unlimited potential and crushing pressure from her ambitious family. The Williams name carried weight in Detroit's legal circles. Her father had been a respected prosecutor, her grandfather a pioneering black judge who had broken barriers in the 1960s. Rebecca was supposed to be the crown jewel of the family legacy, the one who would achieve greatness beyond anything previous generations had imagined. But then came the pregnancy. She had kept it secret for 6 months, terrified of what it would mean for her career. This was the late 2000s, when being an unmarried black mother in the legal profession was still seen as career suicide. Her mother had been merciless when she finally found out. "A black, unwed mother will never make judge," she had said with cold finality. "You have a choice, Rebecca. Your career or that baby. You cannot have both." The family lawyer, Robert Sterling, had presented what seemed like the perfect solution. He specialized in private adoptions, discreet arrangements for families who needed to handle sensitive situations quietly. He assured Rebecca that her baby would go to a loving family, people who desperately wanted a child and could provide opportunities she couldn't offer as a struggling single attorney. The arrangement would be completely confidential. She would never see the baby again, never know where he went, never have any contact. It would be as if the pregnancy never happened. Rebecca had agreed because she was young and scared and believed she had no other choice. She told herself she was being selfless, giving her child a better life than she could provide. But the moment they placed her newborn son in her arms at the hospital, she knew she was making the worst mistake of her life. She had 2 hours with him before Sterling's people came to take him away. 2 hours to memorize his perfect little face, to sing him the lullabies her own mother had sung to her, to breathe in his sweet baby scent, and promise him silently that she would never forget him. She whispered to him about how much she loved him, how sorry she was, how she hoped he would understand someday that this was the hardest thing she had ever done. When they took him away, a piece of her soul went with him. She had named him Daniel in her heart, though she knew his adoptive parents would probably change it. Now, sitting in her chambers 15 years later, Rebecca realized with growing horror that her Daniel might be Elijah Washington, the boy in her courtroom who had been failed by a system that was supposed to protect him. She called her private investigator David Knox, a former police detective who handled sensitive cases for judges and attorneys who needed to keep things quiet. When he answered, her voice was barely a whisper. "David, I need you to investigate a child in my courtroom immediately. Elijah Washington, 8 years old, currently in foster care with the Henderson family. I need to know everything about his background, his placement history, and especially his adoption records from when he was an infant." Knox had worked for Rebecca for 5 years, helping her with background checks on court personnel and security issues. He had never heard her sound like this. "Judge Williams, are you all right? You sound like you've seen a ghost." She almost laughed at the accuracy of his words. "Maybe I have, David. Maybe I have. I need this information today. Money is no object. Call in every favor you have." While Knox began his investigation, Rebecca learned that Elijah had been taken to Child Protective Services for immediate psychological evaluation. The standard procedure after an outburst in court was to assess whether the child was having a mental health crisis or if there were safety concerns. Dr. Sarah Rodriguez, the court's chief child psychologist, was conducting the evaluation at the CPS facility downtown. Rebecca knew she shouldn't interfere, but she called Dr. Rodriguez anyway. "Sarah, I need to know about the Washington boys' evaluation. There may be circumstances about this case that require special attention." Dr. Rodriguez had worked with the court for 8 years and had never heard Judge Williams make such a request. "Rebecca, I can't discuss an ongoing evaluation. You know that. But I will say this boy is remarkable. His memories are incredibly detailed and specific. He's been describing things about your courtroom that only someone who had spent significant time there would know. He drew a picture of your private bathroom, including the lavender soap dispenser and the framed photo of scales of justice that you keep on the windowsill. How would an 8-year-old know those details unless she didn't finish the sentence?" But they both understood the implications. Rebecca spent the rest of the afternoon researching Elijah's case history, using her judicial access to court records. What she found made her stomach turn. Elijah had been placed in 7 different foster homes since entering the system at age 3. The first family, the Clarks, had returned him after 6 months, claiming he was too difficult. The reports mentioned that Elijah would have screaming fits whenever anyone mentioned adoption, claiming his real mother was coming for him. The second family, the Jansons, had him for 8 months before giving up. Their reports described a child who would stare at family court judges on television, becoming agitated and claiming he recognized them. They had punished him for these fantasies by making him sleep in the garage when he refused to stop talking about his mother being a judge. Each subsequent placement had been shorter than the last. Foster families complained that Elijah was too intelligent, too intense, too convinced that his elaborate stories about his origins were real. Social workers had diagnosed him with attachment disorder and recommended therapy, but nothing seemed to help. He remained convinced that his mother was alive, that she was important, and that she would find him someday. When David Knox called back at 6 o'clock, his voice was grim. "Judge Williams, I've got some information, but you're not going to like it. Elijah Washington's adoption records don't exist. I mean, they were destroyed in what's listed as a routine file purge at Sterling Family Services back in 2018. But here's the thing that's really bothering me. Sterling Family Services had their license revoked that same year for what the state called irregularities in placement procedures. The agency that arranged your son's adoption 15 years ago was shut down for illegal practices." Rebecca felt the room spinning around her. What kind of irregularities? The kind where children placed for adoption were never actually adopted. The kind where birth mothers were told their babies went to loving families when really they ended up in the foster system under false identities. "Judge Williams, I think you need to prepare yourself for the possibility that your son never left Detroit. I think he's been right here all along." The next morning found Rebecca sitting across from David Knox in Mel's Diner, a grimy downtown establishment where lawyers and cops grabbed quick coffee between cases. She had chosen this place specifically because none of her judicial colleagues would ever be caught dead in such a dive. The conversation she was about to have could destroy everything she had worked her entire life to build. Knox slid a thick manila folder across the scarred Formica table, his expression grimmer than she had ever seen it. "What I found is going to change everything, Judge Williams. And I mean everything." Rebecca's hands trembled as she opened the folder. Inside were photocopied documents, surveillance photos, and a timeline that made her blood run cold. Knox had worked through the night, calling in favors from contacts in law enforcement, social services, and the underground network of investigators who specialized in finding what powerful people wanted to stay hidden. "Elijah Washington's birth certificate is a forgery," Knox began, keeping his voice low despite the empty diner. "The parents listed are Jennifer and Marcus Washington, who died in a car accident in 2016. But here's the problem. The car accident report shows they were childless. No Elijah, no adoption records, nothing. Someone created an entire false identity for this boy and inserted him into the foster system using dead people's names." Rebecca felt nauseous as Knox continued. "Sterling Family Services didn't just handle irregular adoptions. They were running a full-scale child trafficking operation. They would take babies from desperate mothers, tell them the children were going to loving families, then sell them to whoever paid the most. But sometimes the sales fell through or the buyers changed their minds or the children became too old to be profitable. When that happened, Sterling would dump them into the foster system under false identities, making them essentially disappear." The implications hit Rebecca like a physical blow. "You're saying my son wasn't adopted by a loving family? You're saying he was abandoned in the foster system when he was 3 years old?" Knox nodded grimly. "And it gets worse. I managed to get access to some of Sterling's old financial records before they were sealed. Your family paid $300,000 for what they called a complete disappearance service. That wasn't an adoption fee, Judge Williams. That was payment to make sure your son could never be traced back to you." Rebecca stared at the documents through blurring vision. Her own mother had paid extra to ensure her grandson would vanish completely, that there would be no paper trail, no possibility of reunion, no chance for Rebecca to change her mind and try to find him. The woman who had raised her to value justice above all else had participated in the destruction of an innocent child's life. Meanwhile, 20 miles away at Patricia Williams' house, Elijah was beginning to settle into yet another temporary placement. Patricia was a 68-year-old retired teacher who had been taking in emergency foster children for 15 years. She had seen every kind of trauma, every form of damage that the system could inflict on young minds. But there was something different about Elijah Washington. While most children his age would be playing video games or watching cartoons, Elijah spent his time reading Patricia's law books and asking sophisticated questions about the legal system. He spoke with a vocabulary that belonged to someone 3 times his age, using terms like judicial procedure and custody protocols as naturally as other children talked about toys. "Miss Patricia," Elijah said on his second morning there, looking up from a dusty copy of Michigan family law that he had somehow found in her bookshelf. "Why do judges wear black robes? Is it because they're supposed to be like shadows of justice?" Patricia nearly dropped her coffee cup. This was not a normal 8-year-old question. "Honey, where did you learn words like that?" Elijah's expression became distant, as if he was looking at something she couldn't see. "My real mother taught me. She used to tell me that judges were like guardians of fairness, that their robes were black to remind everyone that justice doesn't see color or wealth or power. She said the gavel was like a magic wand that could make right things happen for people who needed help." Patricia sat down beside him, studying his serious young face. In 15 years of foster care, she had never met a child who maintained such detailed, consistent memories of a birth parent. Most children created fantasies, but their stories changed over time, becoming more elaborate or contradictory. Elijah's memories were different. They were specific, consistent, and filled with details that suggested real experiences rather than wishful thinking. "Tell me more about your real mother, sweetheart." Elijah's eyes lit up with a joy that broke Patricia's heart. "She smells like lavender and vanilla. She has the most beautiful singing voice, especially when she sings the song about the mockingbird. Her hands are soft but strong, and she has a little scar on her thumb from when she was learning to cook and cut herself with a knife. She promised me she would always find me, no matter how far away they took me. Patricia felt chills run down her spine. These weren't the vague memories of a toddler. These were the detailed recollections of someone who had spent significant time with a specific person. Elijah, honey, how old were you when you last saw your real mother? I was 3, but I remember everything. They told me she was dead, but I knew they were lying. I could feel her still loving me, still looking for me. And yesterday in that courtroom, when I saw her sitting up there in her black robe with her gavel, I knew it was her. I knew my mother had found me. The phone rang before Patricia could respond, startling them both. It was Rebecca Williams, and her voice was strained with emotion. Mrs. Williams, this is Judge Rebecca Williams from Family Court. I need to ask you about Elijah Washington. Has he mentioned anything about his memories of his birth mother? Patricia looked at Elijah, who was watching her with those intense, dark eyes. Judge Williams, this child has been telling me things that number 8-year-old should be able to remember. Detailed, specific things about someone who obviously meant the world to him. And after what happened in your courtroom yesterday, I'm starting to think we need to take his memories very seriously. There was a long pause before Rebecca spoke again, and when she did, her voice was barely a whisper. Mrs. Williams, I'm going to ask you something that could get us both in serious trouble. I need to see Elijah privately. There are things about his case that require immediate investigation, and I can't go through official channels. Would you be willing to arrange an unofficial meeting? Patricia looked at Elijah again, seeing the hope that had transformed his young face at the mention of the judge's name. Judge Williams, that boy has been waiting his whole life for his mother to find him. If there's any chance you're who he thinks you are, then we need to find out immediately. Come tonight after dark, and Judge Williams, you better be prepared for what you might discover. Now, I need you to tell me something. Do you think Judge Williams should risk everything to find out if Elijah is really her son? Comment number 1 if you believe she should take the risk, even if it destroys her career. Hit that like button if you're as invested in this story as I am, and make sure you're subscribed to Real Stories Diary, because the next part will reveal secrets that will change everything you think you know about this case. What do you think will happen when Rebecca finally comes face to face with Elijah outside the courtroom? Will he really remember her after 15 years? Or is this all a heartbreaking coincidence? The truth is more shocking than you can imagine, and it's coming up next. At 9 o'clock that night, Rebecca Williams pulled into Patricia Williams' driveway with her heart hammering so hard she could hear it in her ears. She had spent the day wrestling with the decision, knowing that what she was about to do could end her career, destroy her reputation, and possibly land her in jail for judicial misconduct. But the possibility that Elijah was her son had consumed every thought, making it impossible to focus on anything else. She sat in her car for several minutes, gathering courage she wasn't sure she possessed. Through the living room window, she could see Patricia and Elijah sitting together on the couch, the boy's head bent over what appeared to be a book. Even from this distance, even in the dim light, something about his posture, the way he held his head, sent shock waves of recognition through her body. When Patricia opened the front door, Elijah was standing beside her, and the moment Rebecca stepped inside, her world tilted on its axis. Elijah took one look at her and ran straight into her arms with a cry of pure joy. "Mommy, I knew you would come. I knew you wouldn't forget me." Rebecca caught him instinctively, and the feel of his small body against hers unleashed 15 years of suppressed grief and longing. He fit perfectly in her arms, as if no time had passed at all. But what shattered her completely was when he looked up at her with tear-filled eyes and whispered, "You still smell like lavender and vanilla, just like I remembered." Patricia watched in amazement as Elijah began telling Rebecca things that no child his age should be able to remember. He described her car down to the small dent in the rear bumper and the pine tree air freshener she kept hanging from the rear view mirror. He knew about her favorite coffee shop, the one where she went every Sunday morning to read the newspaper and drink hazelnut lattes. He even knew about her private ritual of visiting the botanical garden on her birthday, something she had never told another living soul. "How do you know these things, sweetheart?" Rebecca asked, though her heart was already providing the answer. "I used to go with you sometimes before they took me away." You would carry me in a blue baby seat, and you would talk to me about everything we saw. You told me the names of all the flowers, and you said that gardens were proof that beautiful things could grow even in the hardest ground. Rebecca's vision blurred with tears as memory she had forced herself to forget came flooding back. She had taken her infant son to the botanical garden twice during those precious 2 hours at the hospital, and once more when she had snuck him out for a few minutes before surrendering him to Sterling's people. She had whispered to him about flowers and hope and love, never imagining that her 3-month-old baby would somehow retain those memories. As the evening progressed, Elijah continued to demonstrate knowledge that seemed impossible for a child his age. He knew legal terminology, court procedures, and judicial protocols with the fluency of someone who had spent years studying law. When Rebecca mentioned a case she was working on, he asked intelligent questions about precedent and procedure that would have impressed law school professors. But it was when he began talking about his early foster placements that Rebecca's shock turned to rage. Elijah described being locked in a basement by the Clark family whenever he insisted that his mother was still alive. He told her about the Jansons, who had made him sleep in the garage as punishment for drawing pictures of courtrooms and judges. He remembered the Patterson family who had returned him to social services after him. System, only 2 weeks because he cried too much for his dead mother. Each story was worse than the last. 15 years of systematic emotional abuse inflicted on a child whose only crime was remembering love and refusing to give up hope. They kept telling me you were dead, Elijah said, curled up against Rebecca's side on Patricia's couch. But I could feel in my heart that you were still alive, still looking for me. The social workers said I was sick for believing it, that I needed medication to help me forget my fantasies. But they weren't fantasies, were they, Mommy? Rebecca held him tighter, her fury at the system that had failed him growing with every word. No, baby, they weren't fantasies. I never stopped loving you, and I never stopped hoping I would find you someday. Patricia, who had been listening in stunned silence, finally spoke up. Judge Williams, what Elijah is describing sounds like systematic psychological abuse designed to break his connection to his birth family. In my 15 years of foster care, I've never seen anything like it. It's as if someone deliberately placed him with families who would traumatize him for maintaining his memories. The next morning, Rebecca met with David Knox again, this time in her private chambers. She had made the decision to risk everything to get to the truth. Consequences be damned. David, I need you to investigate Sterling Family Services more thoroughly. I want to know exactly how many children went through their system, what happened to them, and who was involved in placing them, and I need a DNA test done immediately. Knox looked uncomfortable. Judge Williams, if word of this gets out, you're looking at impeachment proceedings, criminal charges, and the end of your career. Are you sure you want to go down this road? Rebecca thought about Elijah sleeping peacefully in Patricia's house, finally reunited with the mother he had never stopped believing in. David, I've spent 22 years on this bench making decisions about children's lives. If there's even a chance that I've been unknowingly participating in a system that stole my own child and countless others, then I have a responsibility to expose it regardless of what it costs me personally. Knox's investigation over the next 3 days revealed horrors that neither of them had imagined. Sterling Family Services had been operating for over 30 years, handling more than 2,000 children. The agency specialized in taking babies from vulnerable mothers, particularly young black women who lacked family support or financial resources. They would promise loving adoptive families, then either sell the children to the highest bidders or dump them into the foster system when sales fell through. But the most disturbing discovery was that Sterling hadn't been working alone. The operation involved social workers, family court judges, attorneys, and even some foster families who were paid to traumatize children into forgetting their origins. It was a systematic effort to destroy family bonds and create untraceable children who could be exploited without consequences. Judge Williams, Knox said, his voice heavy with disgust. I found records of at least 40 other children who were placed in foster care under false identities after Sterling's adoption sales failed. Many of them were told their birth parents were dead, just like Elijah. And here's the really sick part. Several of these children were placed with foster families who were specifically instructed to discourage any talk about birth parents or memories of their early lives. Rebecca felt physically ill as she realized the scope of the conspiracy. You're telling me that children were deliberately traumatized to make them forget their families? It gets worse. I found evidence that some sitting judges had children who went through Sterling's system. Not just you. Judge Harrison Phillips's daughter disappeared 8 years ago and was reported as a runaway. Judge Michael Chan's twin sons were reported as stillborn, but there's no death certificates on file. It's like someone has been systematically targeting the children of people in the legal system. The implications were staggering. If judges and prosecutors had their own children stolen and hidden in the foster system, they could be blackmailed into making decisions that benefited Sterling's network. Cases could be thrown. Adoptions could be approved or denied based on corruption rather than the best interests of children. The entire family court system in Detroit could be compromised. When Rebecca's private phone rang at 2 o'clock in the morning, 3 days later, Patricia's voice was frantic with terror. "Judge Williams, they took him. Someone broke into my house and took Elijah. There was a note saying that if you don't stop investigating, he'll disappear forever." Rebecca's world collapsed the moment she heard Patricia's words. She was dressed and in her car within minutes, driving through empty Detroit streets toward Patricia's house with her emergency lights flashing and her heart pounding like a war drum. When she arrived, the scene was chaos. Police cars filled the street, their red and blue lights casting eerie shadows across the small house where Elijah had finally felt safe. Paramedics were loading Patricia into an ambulance, the elderly woman's face bloodied and her left arm hanging at an unnatural angle. Rebecca pushed through the crowd of officers and reached Patricia just as they were closing the ambulance doors. "Patricia, what happened? Who took him?" Patricia gripped Rebecca's hand with surprising strength despite her injuries. 2 men, white men in expensive suits. They had badges. Said they were federal agents. They knew exactly where Elijah slept, had keys to my house. Judge Williams, they weren't random kidnappers. They knew everything about us, about what we were investigating. They said, if you don't stop digging into Sterling's records, Elijah will be transferred somewhere you'll never find him. Detective James Murphy, a heavy-set white officer with tired eyes and a dismissive attitude, approached Rebecca as the ambulance pulled away. "Judge Williams, I understand you have a personal interest in this case, but we're treating this as a routine runaway situation. The boy has a history of behavioral problems and running away from placements. There's no evidence of actual kidnapping." Rebecca stared at him in disbelief. "Detective Murphy, Patricia Williams was beaten unconscious by men claiming to be federal agents. Her house was broken into. How is that a runaway situation?" Murphy shrugged with infuriating indifference. "Foster kids run away all the time. Sometimes they convince sympathetic adults to help them. The old lady probably hurt herself trying to chase after him when he bolted. We'll put out a routine BOLO alert, but honestly, Judge Williams, these kids usually turn up in a few days when they get hungry enough." Rebecca realized with growing horror that the corruption David Knox had uncovered extended into law enforcement. Murphy wasn't incompetent. He was deliberately sabotaging the investigation. She called David Knox while standing in Patricia's destroyed living room, stepping over broken furniture and family photos scattered across the floor. "David, they have Elijah, and the police are refusing to investigate properly. We're on our own." Knox's voice was grim. "I was afraid this would happen. I've been monitoring communications from Sterling's old network, and there's been a lot of chatter about cleaning up loose ends. Judge Williams, they're not just trying to silence Elijah. They're planning to eliminate everyone who knows about the corruption, including you." Over the next 18 hours, Rebecca used every contact she had built during her 22 years in the legal system. She called in favors from federal prosecutors, FBI agents, and appellate court judges. But everywhere she turned, she met resistance. Cases were mysteriously reassigned. Evidence requests were denied due to jurisdictional issues, and potential allies suddenly became unavailable. The conspiracy was deeper and more extensive than anyone had imagined. David Knox worked around the clock using his network of private investigators and former law enforcement contacts to track down leads. What he discovered made Rebecca's blood run cold. Sterling Family Services was still operating under different names, moving children through an underground network that stretched across multiple states. The children weren't just being adopted illegally. They were being trafficked for labor exploitation and worse. Judge Williams, I found the facility where they're holding Elijah. It's called Riverside Youth Center, about 40 miles north of Detroit. Officially, it's a residential treatment facility for troubled youth. Unofficially, it's where they take children who need to disappear permanently. Riverside Youth Center looked innocuous enough from the outside. A collection of brick buildings surrounded by high fences and mature trees designed to look like a private school or summer camp. But Knox's sources had revealed its true purpose. Children brought to Riverside were processed for permanent removal from any official system. Their identities were completely erased, their medical and educational records destroyed, and they were either sold to buyers in other countries or disappeared entirely. Rebecca attempted to get a search warrant for the facility, but every judge she approached found technical reasons to deny her request. District Attorney Paul Morrison, who had built his career on prosecuting child abuse cases, suddenly refused to take her calls. It became clear that Morrison had received substantial campaign contributions from companies linked to Sterling's network. When official channels failed, Rebecca made a decision that would either save Elijah or destroy them both. She would retrieve her son herself. Legal consequences be damned. That evening, Knox disguised himself as a maintenance worker and infiltrated Riverside Youth Center. What he found there would haunt him for the rest of his life. The facility housed over 60 children, most of them black or Hispanic, all of them systematically isolated from the outside world. They were told their families were dead, that no one was looking for them, that their only hope for survival was complete obedience to their captives. Knox found Elijah in a basement cell, alone and terrified, but still defiant. The boy's face lit up with desperate hope when Knox whispered that his mother was coming for him. "The guards told me Judge Rebecca forgot about me," Elijah whispered through tears. "They said she decided she didn't want a son who caused trouble, but I knew they were lying. I knew my mommy would never give up on me." Knox's heart broke as he looked at this brave little boy who had endured horrors no child should face, but had never stopped believing in his mother's love. "Elijah, your mother has been fighting to find you every second since you were taken. She's coming tonight, and she's going to take you home where you belong." As Knox prepared to leave, one of the guards mentioned casually that the facility would be cleaned out the next day. All the children were being transferred to locations outside the United States, places where they would never be found. Rebecca had less than 12 hours to save not just Elijah, but dozens of other stolen children whose only crime was being born to parents who couldn't protect them from a system designed to exploit the most vulnerable members of society. Rebecca Williams stood in the parking lot of an abandoned warehouse at midnight, staring at the lights of Riverside Youth Center in the distance. Beside her were 3 people who had risked everything to help her. Judge Harrison Phillips, whose 8-year-old daughter had been stolen by Sterling's network 5 years earlier. Detective Maria Santos, an honest cop whose 10-year-old son had disappeared into the same system, and David Knox, whose investigation had uncovered the scope of the conspiracy. They all knew that what they were about to do would end their careers and possibly land them in federal prison. But they also knew that if they didn't act tonight, dozens of children would disappear forever. Judge Phillips checked her watch with hands that trembled slightly. "Rebecca, once we go through with this, there's no going back. We'll be branded as criminals, kidnappers, vigilantes. Are you prepared for that?" Rebecca thought about Elijah, locked in a basement cell, believing his mother had abandoned him. She thought about all the other children in that facility who had been told the same lies, who had given up hope of ever seeing their families again. "Harrison, I've spent 22 years upholding a system that I believed protected children. If that system is corrupt enough to steal my own son and traumatize him for 5 years, then maybe it's time to tear it down and build something better." Detective Santos had used her law enforcement connections to obtain blueprints of the Riverside facility and information about their security systems. The children are housed in the basement level, separated by age groups. Elijah should be in Section C along with other children between ages 6 and 10. "But Rebecca, you need to know that many of these children have been so traumatized that they might not trust us. They've been told that anyone claiming to be family is lying to them." The plan was dangerous and illegal, but it was their only option. Knox would disable the security systems using skills he had learned during his years as a detective. Santos would handle any guards they encountered, using her authority as a police officer to create confusion. Phillips would coordinate the evacuation of children while Rebecca focused on finding Elijah and gathering evidence of the facility's crimes. At 12:30 a.m., they approached the facility through the wooded area behind the main buildings. The security was lighter than expected, which made Knox nervous. "This feels too easy," he whispered as they reached the basement entrance. "Either they're incredibly overconfident, or they're expecting us." They found out which one it was when they opened the basement door and discovered dozens of children huddled together in what could only be described as cages. The sight was so horrific that Judge Phillips had to cover her mouth to keep from crying out. These weren't dormitory rooms or even prison cells. They were literal cages, barely large enough for a child to lie down, with concrete floors and metal bars. Many of the children were younger than 10, their eyes hollow with despair and trauma. When Rebecca called out Elijah's name, she heard a small voice respond from the far end of the corridor. She ran toward the sound and found her son in a cell so small he couldn't stand upright. He was thin and pale, but his eyes still held the spark of intelligence and defiance that had helped him survive 5 years in hell. "Mommy," he whispered, as if afraid to believe what he was seeing. "Is it really you?" Rebecca fumbled with the lock on his cage, her hands shaking so badly she could barely function. "It's me, baby. I'm here. I'm going to get you out of here, and we're never going to be separated again." As Knox worked to free the other children, he discovered a computer system that contained files on every child who had passed through Sterling's network over the past 30 years. The evidence was overwhelming. Detailed records of children stolen, families destroyed, and officials bribed or blackmailed into silence. But the most shocking discovery was a set of video files that revealed the true scope of the conspiracy. The recordings showed judges, prosecutors, social workers, and politicians participating in meetings where children were discussed like commodities. Rebecca watched in horror as she saw her own mother on one of the recordings, discussing the disposal of her grandson with cold calculation. Even worse, she discovered recordings of herself presiding over custody hearings where she had unknowingly separated stolen children from their biological families. Every decision she had made, every case she had ruled on, had been influenced by Sterling's network. They had promoted her to the bench specifically because they needed a respected black judge to give legitimacy to their operations. Her entire career had been orchestrated by the same people who had stolen her son. Judge Phillips's voice cracked as she called out from another section of the basement. "Rebecca, you need to see this. Maria, help me with these children." They had found a room filled with medical equipment and files documenting experiments conducted on the children. The stolen children weren't just being trafficked. They were being used as test subjects for psychological conditioning techniques designed to break their connections to their birth families. The goal was to create children so damaged and traumatized that they would never seek their origins or question their circumstances. As they worked to evacuate the children, alarms began blaring throughout the facility. Bright lights flooded the corridors, and they could hear vehicles approaching outside. Sterling's security forces had arrived, but instead of police uniforms, they wore military-style gear and carried weapons that suggested this was a private army rather than law enforcement. "They're not here to arrest us," Knox realized with growing dread. "They're here to eliminate witnesses." Rebecca faced an impossible choice. They could escape with Elijah and a few other children, leaving dozens behind to face whatever Sterling's people had planned, or they could stay and fight to save every child, knowing they would probably all be killed in the process. She looked at Elijah, who was clinging to her arm with desperate strength. Then she looked at the faces of dozens of other children who were counting on them for salvation. "David, get Elijah and 10 of the youngest children out through the back exit. Take them to the safe house we discussed. Maria, Harrison, and I are staying to finish this." Elijah refused to let go of her hand. "Mommy, don't leave me again. Please don't leave me." Rebecca knelt down and looked into her son's eyes, memorizing his face in case this was the last time she would see him. "Baby, I need you to be brave for just a little bit longer. Go with Mr. Knox, and I promise I will come for you as soon as I can. But right now, there are other children here who need help, and I can't leave them behind." Do you understand? Elijah nodded through his tears, showing the same courage that had sustained him through 5 years of unimaginable trauma. Save them all, Mommy. Save them all like you saved me. What would you do in Rebecca's situation? Would you save your own child and run, or would you risk everything to save children you've never met? Comment number 1 if you think she should focus on saving Elijah, or comment number 2 if you believe she should stay and fight for all the children. Hit that like button if this story is keeping you on the edge of your seat, and make sure you're subscribed to Real Stories Diary, because what happens next will determine not just Elijah's fate, but the fate of dozens of innocent children. Will Rebecca's sacrifice be enough to expose this horrific conspiracy, or will Sterling's forces silence her forever? The next part will show you just how far a mother will go to protect not just her own child, but every child who has been failed by a corrupt system. Rebecca Williams made her choice with the kind of clarity that comes only in moments of absolute crisis. She kissed Elijah's forehead, whispered, "I love you," into his ear, and watched David Knox carry her son toward the emergency exit along with 10 of the youngest children from the facility. Then she turned back to face the dozens of children still trapped in Sterling's nightmare, knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether justice would finally prevail or whether the conspiracy would claim even more victims. Sterling himself arrived at the facility within minutes, accompanied by a small army of private security contractors and corrupt officials who had spent decades protecting his operation. Robert Sterling was 73 years old now, but his eyes still held the cold calculation that had allowed him to destroy thousands of families without remorse. He found Rebecca in the main corridor, standing protectively in front of 26 children who ranged in age from 6 to 15. "Judge Williams," Sterling said with mock politeness, "you've caused quite a disturbance tonight, but I'm prepared to offer you a deal that will benefit everyone involved." Rebecca kept her phone hidden behind her back, live streaming everything to her social media accounts and sending copies to every news outlet she could think of. "The only deal I'm interested in, Sterling, is the one where you spend the rest of your miserable life in federal prison." Sterling smiled with the confidence of someone who had never faced real consequences for his actions. "I don't think you understand your situation, Judge Williams. You're trespassing on private property, interfering with the lawful operation of a licensed youth facility, and kidnapping children who are legally in state custody. Even if you survive tonight, you'll face federal charges that will put you in prison for the rest of your life." But Rebecca had spent the last week preparing for this moment. "Actually, Sterling, I think you're the one who doesn't understand the situation. Right now, thousands of people are watching a live video feed of your illegal detention facility. They can see the cages you've been keeping children in. They can hear your admission that you've been running unlawful operations, and they have access to all the computer files we downloaded before you arrived." Sterling's expression shifted from confidence to rage as he realized that his carefully constructed conspiracy was being exposed in real time. He ordered his security team to seize Rebecca's phone, but it was too late. The video had already been shared thousands of times, picked up by major news networks, and viewed by law enforcement agencies across the country. What Sterling didn't know was that Detective Santos had anticipated his arrival and had been coordinating with FBI agent Lisa Park, whose own niece had been stolen by Sterling's network 8 years earlier. Agent Park had been conducting her own investigation into child trafficking operations, and Rebecca's live stream provided the evidence she needed to launch an immediate federal raid. Within 30 minutes, the facility was surrounded by legitimate federal agents, local police who weren't on Sterling's payroll, and news crews who had been alerted by Rebecca's viral video. For the first time in 30 years, Sterling's operation was exposed to the kind of scrutiny that money and corruption couldn't suppress. But Sterling had one final card to play as federal agents stormed the facility. He revealed the true scope of his power and the desperation that drove him to destroy anyone who threatened his empire. "You want to know the truth about your precious son, Judge Williams?" Sterling snarled as FBI agents placed him in handcuffs. "I didn't just steal him from you. I made sure he suffered every day for 5 years because I knew that someday you might become a problem. Every beating, every night locked in a basement, every foster family that abused him, that was all designed specifically to break him so completely that even if you found him, he would be too damaged to be worth saving." Rebecca felt rage unlike anything she had ever experienced. But she forced herself to remain calm. Sterling was trying to provoke her into doing something that would undermine the case against him. Instead, she looked him directly in the eyes and spoke with the authority of someone who had spent decades dispensing justice. "Robert Sterling, you are under arrest for conspiracy, child trafficking, kidnapping, fraud, and crimes against humanity. You have the right to remain silent, and I strongly suggest you use it, because everything you say is being recorded and will be used to ensure that you never see freedom again." As Sterling was led away in chains, Rebecca turned her attention to the children who had been rescued from the facility. Many of them were in shock, unable to believe that their nightmare was finally over. Some had been in the system so long that they had forgotten their real names or their families of origin. All of them would need extensive therapy, medical care, and time to heal from trauma that no child should ever endure. But they were alive. They were free. And they would finally have the chance to reclaim their stolen lives. Judge Phillips, who had been documenting evidence throughout the raid, approached Rebecca with tears streaming down her face. "Rebecca, we found her. We found my Sarah. She's in the medical wing, and she remembers me. After 8 years, my little girl remembers me." Detective Santos emerged from another section of the facility with similar news. "My son Carlos is here, too. He's 15 now, but he's alive and he's safe. Rebecca, what we did tonight, we didn't just save these children. We exposed a conspiracy that was destroying families across the entire country." Over the next several hours, as federal agents processed the evidence and social workers began the delicate task of reuniting children with their families, Rebecca learned the full scope of what they had accomplished. Sterling's network had involved over 200 officials across 15 states. The computer files they had recovered contained evidence of corruption that reached into the highest levels of government, including federal judges, senators, and cabinet members who had either participated in the conspiracy or had been blackmailed into silence. The live stream of the raid had been viewed over 5 million times within 12 hours, sparking a national conversation about corruption in the family court system and the vulnerability of children in state care. Social media was flooded with stories from families who suspected their own children had been stolen, and law enforcement agencies across the country were launching investigations into similar operations. But perhaps the most important discovery was that this wasn't just about money or power. Sterling's network had been conducting systematic psychological experiments on stolen children, studying how to break family bonds and create people who would be easier to control and exploit. The implications went far beyond child trafficking. This was research into how to destroy the fundamental human connections that hold society together. As dawn broke over the Riverside facility, Rebecca finally allowed herself to believe that the nightmare was ending. Elijah was safe with David Knox at the secure location they had arranged. Dozens of other children were beginning the long journey back to their families, and the conspiracy that had stolen her son and countless others was finally being exposed to the light of justice. But she also knew that the battle was far from over. Sterling's arrest was just the beginning. The real work would be prosecuting everyone involved, reforming the systems that had allowed such corruption to flourish, and helping the victims heal from trauma that would affect them for the rest of their lives. Most importantly, she had to face the possibility that her own career as a judge was over, that she would be prosecuted for the illegal action she had taken to save the children, and that the price of justice might be higher than she had imagined. 6 weeks after the raid on Riverside Youth Center, Rebecca Williams sat in the defendant's chair in the same courtroom where her life had changed forever. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was being prosecuted for judicial misconduct in the very room where Elijah had first declared her to be his mother. Federal prosecutors, under pressure from politicians connected to Sterling's network, had charged her with abuse of power, obstruction of justice, and violation of judicial ethics. If convicted, she faced up to 15 years in federal prison. The trial had become a national sensation, dividing public opinion between those who saw Rebecca as a hero who had exposed a massive conspiracy and those who believed that judges couldn't be allowed to break the law regardless of their motivations. Outside the courthouse, protesters held signs reading "Free Judge Williams and Justice for Stolen Children," while counter-protesters demanded that she be held accountable for her illegal actions. Inside the courtroom, Sterling himself was the star witness for the prosecution. Despite being confined in federal custody, awaiting his own trial, he had agreed to testify against Rebecca in exchange for a plea deal that would reduce his potential sentence from life imprisonment to 30 years. It was his final opportunity to destroy the woman who had brought down his empire. Rebecca's defense attorney, David Chen, had warned her that Sterling would try to use the trial to inflict maximum psychological damage. He knows he's going to prison for the rest of his life, Chen had explained. His only remaining goal is to hurt you and Elijah as much as possible before he's silenced forever. When Sterling took the witness stand, his appearance shocked everyone. The powerful man who had controlled a multi-million-dollar criminal enterprise for 30 years looked frail and defeated, but his eyes still burned with malevolent intelligence. He had spent 6 weeks in federal custody preparing for this moment, and he intended to make it count. "Your Honor," Sterling began, addressing Judge Patricia Morrison, who was presiding over Rebecca's trial. "Judge Williams has portrayed herself as a heroic mother rescuing her stolen son. But the truth is far more complicated and far more damaging to her reputation than she wants the public to know." The prosecutor, Assistant U.S. Attorney James Harrison, led Sterling through his testimony with calculated precision. "Mr. Sterling, please tell the court about your relationship with Judge Williams prior to the events at Riverside Youth Center." Sterling's smile was cruel as he began to reveal secrets that Rebecca had hoped would never see the light of day. "Judge Williams didn't just give up her child for adoption 15 years ago. She paid me specifically to ensure that the child would disappear completely, that there would be no paper trail, no possibility of reunion, no chance for her to change her mind. She wanted to advance her career, and she saw her own son as an obstacle to her ambitions." Rebecca felt the courtroom spinning around her as Sterling continued his character assassination. "Furthermore, Judge Williams wasn't an innocent victim of my operation. For the past 10 years, I've been providing her with information about the children appearing in her courtroom. She knew that many of them were placed through irregular channels, and she made custody decisions based on my recommendations rather than the best interests of the children." The allegations were devastating, and Rebecca could see doubt creeping into the faces of jurors who had initially been sympathetic to her cause. Sterling was mixing just enough truth with his lies to make the fabrications believable. He had documents showing payments from the Williams family, recordings of phone conversations taken out of context, and testimony from corrupt social workers who claimed Rebecca had been complicit in the conspiracy. But Sterling's most damaging revelation was yet to come. "Your Honor, Judge Williams didn't rescue her son from Riverside Youth Center out of maternal love. She did it because she discovered that I had been blackmailing her for years, using her son's location as leverage to control her judicial decisions. When she realized that her political career was about to be destroyed by exposure of our relationship, she orchestrated the raid to eliminate evidence of her complicity." The prosecution presented Sterling's version of events with devastating effectiveness. They showed financial records suggesting that Rebecca had been receiving payments from Sterling's organization. They presented testimony from corrupt officials who claimed she had been making judicial decisions based on bribes rather than law. They even produced fake evidence suggesting that Rebecca had known Elijah's location for years, but had chosen not to retrieve him until it became politically necessary. As Rebecca listened to Sterling's lies being accepted as truth, she realized that this final confrontation wasn't just about her freedom or reputation. It was about whether justice could survive in a system so corrupted that truth and falsehood had become indistinguishable. Sterling was using the very courtroom where children's fates were decided to destroy the woman who had exposed his crimes against those same children. When it came time for Rebecca's defense, David Chen faced an almost impossible task. How do you prove someone's innocence when the criminal accusing them has spent 30 years perfecting the art of deception? How do you demonstrate heroic motivation when every action can be twisted to suggest selfish calculation? The answer came from an unexpected source, Elijah himself. Despite being only 8 years old, Elijah insisted on testifying in his mother's defense. Child psychologists had evaluated him extensively and determined that he was competent to testify, though the trauma he had endured made his testimony emotionally devastating to witness. When Elijah took the witness stand, the entire courtroom fell silent. This small boy, wearing his best suit and speaking with a maturity that belied his years, represented every child who had been failed by the system that was supposed to protect them. "Mr. Sterling is lying about my mommy," Elijah said, looking directly at the jury with the same intensity that had stopped the courtroom months earlier. "She never stopped looking for me. Even when I was being hurt by the bad families, I could feel her love reaching out to me. She risked everything to save me and all the other children, and she didn't do it for her job or her reputation. She did it because she's my mother, and mothers don't abandon their children, no matter how much it costs them. Elijah's testimony revealed details about Sterling's operation that only a victim could know. He described the systematic psychological abuse designed to make children forget their families, the medical experiments conducted without consent, and the deliberate placement of stolen children with abusive foster families. But most importantly, he provided evidence that Sterling had been lying about Rebecca's complicity. Mr. Sterling used to tell me that my mother didn't want me, that she had paid extra money to make sure I would never find her, Elijah testified. But I knew he was lying because mothers don't stop loving their children. And when I saw her in that courtroom, I knew that she had been looking for me my whole life, just like I had been looking for her. The trial lasted 3 more weeks, with testimony from dozens of witnesses and presentation of thousands of pages of evidence. FBI agent Lisa Park testified about the legitimate investigation that Rebecca's actions had supported. Social workers described the systematic abuse that Sterling's network had inflicted on vulnerable children. Medical experts explained the long-term psychological damage caused by the trafficking operation. When the jury finally deliberated Rebecca's fate, they had to weigh her illegal actions against the massive corruption she had exposed. They had to decide whether breaking unjust laws in order to save innocent children constituted heroism or criminality. They had to determine whether the system that had failed so many families deserved protection or reform. After 18 hours of deliberation, the jury reached their verdict. The jury foreman stood in the packed courtroom, holding the piece of paper that would determine Rebecca Williams's fate and send a message about whether justice could triumph over corruption in America's family court system. The silence was so complete that the sound of his clearing his throat seemed to echo off the walls. On the charge of abuse of judicial power, we find the defendant not guilty. On the charge of obstruction of justice, we find the defendant not guilty. On the charge of violation of judicial ethics, we find the defendant not guilty on the grounds of necessity and public interest. The courtroom erupted in cheers and tears as Rebecca collapsed into her chair, overwhelmed by relief and gratitude. Elijah, who had been sitting in the front row with Patricia Williams, ran to his mother and threw his arms around her. For the first time in 8 months, they were together and free, no longer fighting for survival, but finally able to begin healing. But the jury foreman wasn't finished. Your Honor, the jury would like to make a statement. We find that Judge Williams' actions, while technically illegal, were morally justified and necessary to expose a conspiracy that had been destroying families for decades. We believe that sometimes, when the system fails so completely, individuals must choose between following unjust laws and protecting innocent lives. Judge Williams chose to protect children, and we commend her courage. 6 months later, Rebecca stood before a Senate Judiciary Committee, testifying about the reforms needed to prevent another Sterling-style conspiracy from devastating American families. She had voluntarily resigned from the bench, but instead of facing imprisonment, she had been appointed as a special prosecutor tasked with investigating child trafficking operations across the country. Sterling and 47 of his associates had been convicted on federal charges ranging from kidnapping to racketeering. Sterling himself received 3 consecutive life sentences and was serving his time in solitary confinement for his own protection. Even in federal prison, he had made so many enemies by targeting children that his life wouldn't be worth much in the general population. The investigation Rebecca had triggered had led to the rescue of over 300 children who had been stolen from their families through various illegal adoption schemes. Many of these children, now teenagers or young adults, were slowly rebuilding relationships with birth families they had been told were dead. Support groups had formed across the country, connecting survivors of trafficking operations and helping them heal from trauma that would affect them for years to come. Judge Phillips had been reunited with her daughter Sarah, who was now 13 and struggling to adjust to life outside the trafficking network, but slowly learning to trust again. Detective Santos's son, Carlos, now 16, had become an advocate for other trafficking victims and was planning to study law enforcement so he could prevent other children from experiencing what he had endured. The Riverside Youth Center had been converted into a legitimate facility for helping trafficking survivors, funded by assets seized from Sterling's criminal empire. Rebecca worked there twice a week, providing legal assistance to families trying to navigate the complex process of reunification and helping survivors understand their rights under the new federal legislation that had been passed in response to her case. Elijah, now 9 years old, was thriving in ways that seemed miraculous given what he had endured. He was enrolled in a gifted education program, attended regular therapy sessions to process his trauma, and had formed close friendships with other children for the first time in his life. But most importantly, he was living with his mother in a small apartment in downtown Detroit, finally experiencing the unconditional love and security that every child deserves. The psychological scars would probably never completely heal, but Elijah was learning that survival was only the first step. The real victory was in building a life filled with love, purpose, and hope. Rebecca had established the Daniel Williams Foundation, named after the son she had lost and found again, using the name she had whispered to him during those precious hours in the hospital 15 years earlier. The foundation provided legal assistance to families searching for missing children, funded research into improving the foster care system, and lobbied for legislation to protect vulnerable children from exploitation. Every morning, Rebecca and Elijah would walk to school together, stopping at the botanical garden where she had once brought him as an infant. They would spend a few minutes among the flowers, talking about their plans for the day and the progress being made on cases involving other missing children. Elijah had started keeping a journal documenting their daily conversations, saying he wanted to remember every moment they had together to make up for the years they had lost. The legal system was slowly reforming in response to the scandal Rebecca had exposed. New protocols required multiple independent reviews of adoption cases, background checks for all personnel involved in child placement, and regular audits of private agencies handling family services. It wasn't perfect, and corruption would probably never be completely eliminated, but the changes made it much harder for another Sterling to operate with impunity. One evening in spring, as Rebecca helped Elijah with his homework at their kitchen table, he looked up from his math problems with a question that surprised her. "Mommy, do you ever regret becoming a judge? If you hadn't been on the bench, maybe Mr. Sterling wouldn't have targeted our family." Rebecca set down her coffee and considered how to answer. It was a question she had asked herself many times during the darkest moments of their ordeal. "Elijah, sweetheart, I spent 22 years thinking that my job was to enforce laws and maintain order in the courtroom. But you taught me that sometimes the most important justice happens outside the law, when people choose to do what's right instead of what's safe. I lost my position as a judge, but I found something much more valuable, the knowledge that love is stronger than any system designed to separate families." Elijah smiled and returned to his math homework, but Rebecca could see him processing her words with the same intensity he brought to everything else. This boy, who had survived trafficking, abuse, and systematic attempts to destroy his connection to his family, was now using his intelligence and courage to help other children facing similar challenges. A few weeks later, Rebecca received a letter that brought tears to her eyes. It was from a woman in California whose 3-year-old son had been stolen through a fake adoption agency similar to Sterling's operation. The woman had seen news coverage of Rebecca's case and had used the information to track down her son, who had been placed with an abusive foster family under a false identity. The boy was now safely home with his mother, and they were both receiving counseling to heal from their separation. The letter was one of dozens that Rebecca received every week from families who had been reunited because of the investigation she had triggered. Each one represented a victory against the forces that profited from destroying families, a confirmation that their suffering had served a purpose larger than themselves. On a quiet Sunday morning in late spring, Rebecca and Elijah sat in their garden, planting flowers in memory of all the children who hadn't survived Sterling's network. They had started this ritual as a way of honoring the victims while celebrating the survivors, creating beauty in soil that had once seemed permanently poisoned by cruelty and corruption. "Mommy," Elijah said as he carefully placed a small sunflower seedling in the rich earth. "When I grow up, I want to be a lawyer like you. I want to help find missing children and bring them home to their families." Rebecca watched her son's serious young face as he worked, seeing in him the same determination that had helped him survive 5 years of hell without losing hope. "That would be wonderful, sweetheart. The world needs more people who understand that families are worth fighting for, no matter how powerful the forces trying to destroy them." As they worked together in their garden, surrounded by flowers that represented hope and renewal, Rebecca reflected on how much their lives had changed since that day in Courtroom 7, when Elijah had pointed at her and declared her to be his mother. They had lost almost everything: her judicial career, their privacy, their sense of safety and security. But in losing those things, they had gained something infinitely more precious: each other, and the knowledge that love could survive even the most determined attempts to destroy it. The sun was setting over Detroit as they finished their planting, casting long shadows across their small garden. Rebecca looked at Elijah, who was carefully watering each seedling with the same attention to detail he brought to everything important in his life, and felt overwhelmed with gratitude for the chain of events that had brought them together again. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, more families to help, more corruption to expose, more children to rescue from systems designed to exploit them. But tonight, they were simply a mother and son together at last, planning a future built on justice, love, and the absolute certainty that no force on earth could ever separate them again. What do you think about this incredible story of a mother's love conquering a corrupt system? If you believe that Rebecca and Elijah's story shows the power of never giving up on family, comment below and share your thoughts about how we can better protect vulnerable children in our communities. If this story moved you, please hit the like button to help spread awareness about child trafficking and the courage it takes to fight institutional corruption. Make sure to subscribe to Real Stories Diary for more stories that expose injustice and celebrate the triumph of love over evil. And don't forget to share this video with anyone who needs to be reminded that sometimes ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when they refuse to accept that wrong is stronger than right. Rebecca and Elijah's journey reminds us that families are worth fighting for, that justice sometimes requires breaking unjust laws, and that love really can move mountains when it's guided by courage and determination. Thank you for joining me on this incredible journey. And remember, in a world that sometimes seems dominated by darkness, heroes like Rebecca Williams prove that light will always find a way to shine through. May we all have the courage to stand up for what's right, even when the cost seems too high to bear. Rebecca and Elijah's extraordinary journey teaches us profound lessons about the unbreakable power of maternal love and the courage required to challenge corrupt systems. Their story demonstrates that sometimes doing what's morally right means breaking unjust laws, especially when innocent lives hang in the balance. Rebecca's willingness to sacrifice her prestigious career to save her son and dozens of other children shows us that true success isn't measured by professional achievements, but by our commitment to protecting the most vulnerable members of society. The conspiracy Sterling orchestrated reveals how institutional corruption can flourish when good people remain silent or choose personal comfort over moral obligation. It reminds us that vigilance is the price of justice, and that we must question authority when it fails to serve those it's meant to protect. Elijah's resilience throughout 5 years of systematic abuse illustrates the incredible strength of the human spirit and the power of hope to sustain us through unimaginable darkness. Perhaps most importantly, this story shows us that family bonds transcend legal documents, social systems, and even time itself. Love leaves permanent imprints on our hearts that no amount of trauma can completely erase. Rebecca and Elijah found each other again because neither ever stopped believing in their connection, proving that faith and love can overcome even the most determined efforts to destroy it. What would you do if you discovered your own child had been stolen by a corrupt system? Would you have the courage to risk everything like Rebecca did, or would fear hold you back? Share your thoughts in the comments below about how we can better protect vulnerable children in our communities. If Rebecca and Elijah's story inspired you to believe in the power of never giving up on family, hit that like button to show your support for mothers and children fighting against impossible odds. Make sure to subscribe to Real Stories Diary for more incredible true stories that expose injustice and celebrate the triumph of love over corruption. Share this video with anyone who needs to be reminded that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when they refuse to accept that wrong is stronger than right. Your engagement helps these important stories reach families who might be facing similar struggles. Thank you for joining me on this emotional journey that proves love really can move mountains. May you always have the strength to fight for what matters most. And remember that sometimes the greatest victories come from the battles we never expected to fight.